Okay, so some people are good at extemporizing, at improvising. I'm not one of those people, so I actually have the text that I'm going to read to you here. I try to do it in a kind of passionate way. I'm going to speak as well, read as well as talk to you, and improvise between lines, trying to explain and extrapolate a little bit. But the text itself is very, a lot of time was spent putting it together, so it should be clear, it should come out. I do want to say that if something really isn't clear and it's a stumper for you, just throw up your hand. I'll try to come to you. If you need me to stop and explain something, I'm happy to do that. Hopefully that won't be necessary, but feel free. So let's begin with Plato's Republic. Let me say that I'm going to put aside all historical and biographical context here, and I'm going to jump right into the debate of Plato's Republic. Having rejected all attempts at a definition of justice by old Cephalus and Polemarchus, it is Thrasymachus, the Friedrich Nietzsche, the Nietzsche of 4th century BC in some sense. It is Thrasymachus' last challenge, which largely sets the stage for the Republic. Thrasymachus has thrown down the gauntlet to assert that justice is, quote, nothing else than the interest of the stronger, quote, unquote, of those who rule, which is as much as to say that justice is a sham or a lie. It's false. Yet Thrasymachus' position is rejected by Plato's primary spokesman in the dialogue, Socrates. Remember, Socrates is the representative of Plato's positions in the dialogue, and Socrates was his real-life teacher. Socrates argues that the art of rulership against Thrasymachus never takes the interest of the rule as primary. By definition, a ruler doesn't rule for him or herself, but for the interest of the people. Despite this rebuttal, Socrates has yet to provide a positive definition of justice and sets out to find one. With this, the great work of the Republic has begun, in search of justice. Having arrived at the task of defining justice as a good in itself, regardless of its consequences, Socrates and his main discussants, Glaucon and Adeimantus, agree to take up the search. They agree to search first at the macro level of the state, and only latter at the micro level of the individual, so they may find it more easily in the larger body, that being the state, right? They're going to use the state as an easier target. It's going to be easier to find justice in the state, and once we've done that, they believe they can come back to the person and we'll find it there. Somehow there will be a kind of direct correlation, an analogy. In this way, Plato proposes to proceed from politics to psychology and ethics on the basis of the analogy of the state and the soul, the latter the microcosm of the former. This deductive procedure seeks the individual through the lens of the larger body politic and is oriented towards viewing the totality in the particular, and the part specifically as part of the whole. And that's crucial for understanding Plato. In this way, it may be said that this procedure, critically, diminishes the diversity of individual differences that might present resistance to the harmonic unity of citizen and state. These tensions between plurality, democracy, and traditional authority and unity within the state were already at play in Athens, with the emergence of democratizing social and political forces, and Plato was very much struggling specifically against these at the level of thought. Plato is no friend to democracy. Socrates moves towards an understanding of justice considered aside from its reward, with a view to, quote, the essential good and evil which justice and injustice work in the possessors of them, end quote. All agree upon this as the necessary route to disprove the common view held by Thrasymachus, as we said, that might is right, and that justice is the prerogative of the powerful through domination. Thus, Socrates and his two primary discussants set out to prove that justice is not only consequentially best for the happiness it brings, but also best in and of itself, regardless of its consequences. And this begins their inquiry into the ideal form of the state, right? We're no longer looking for justice in the person. We've gone off in a slightly different direction with the hopes of coming back to the individual afterwards. Socrates starts by laying out the economic organization necessary for the state to exist. He lays out the basic divisions of labor, which he holds as the conditions of life necessary for the community to flourish. Merchants, workers, and buyers all interact to provide the variety of goods available and necessary for life. Each type of labor must be performed by those whose natures, those whose inner qualities best fit the work. such that the division of labor most effectively, in their opinions, utilizes the natural abilities and talents of all citizens. As the city's needs and wants expand into Glaucon's so-called city of pigs, there will be a demand for expansion of lands in order to provide for growing wants and luxury, right? With this, Socrates informs us that they have, quote, discovered war to be derived from causes which are also the causes of almost all the evils in the state, private as well as public. And this is avarice, the desire for more endlessly, that he's pointing to. From these beginnings of the search for justice in the state, the harmonization of differences and the suppression of conflict are taken as constitutional and central principles of order. Unity, not diversity, appears to be Plato's primary concern. To the end of material and territorial expansion, a place of military training will be necessary, and the division of labor is again applied to those, so that those who are most fit will fill out an army, most fit to be warriors. Such warriors will have to be tempered, trained, developed, so that they do not devour, consume the city itself. Socrates turns to the analogy of the courage of dogs as epitomizing spirit and bravery, or as they knew it, thumos, spirit, in order to imagine a class of soldiers who will prove fierce to enemies, but soft, yielding, and welcoming to friends and citizens. The most fitting education for the soldiers Socrates finds in a regimen of music and gymnastics. A strong program of censorship is set up in order to encourage some themes and to repress others. All harmful examples of passion, irrationality, or cowardice from the poets or the myths are to be eliminated from the education of the youth who will need to become the brave defenders of the polis. The state itself, on the other hand, may produce fictions, and the rulers may censor and lie for the public good. The poets, on the other hand, are not to be trusted. Plato now pushes the dialogue onwards to ask the primary political question, right? Who shall rule? Who will rule? He begins his search for the best rulers in holding that the best amongst the old must rule the young. The elite, this elderly elite, should be for the common people, but not of them. At this point, Plato fashions his political myth of the earth-born caste. That is, his famous myth of the metals. Youth must be taught that all their training and early education were experienced in the ground, in the earth, and that this training, this experience yielded in them a specific nature, gold, silver, or bronze, and that the Greek soil itself from which they were born is their true mother, which is to be cherished and defended from all enemies. The identification with a class of metals will dictate a citizen's station, their place, their class in society, and their status. Though these social strata, these layers, these levels, are fixed for life for the individual, they are not inherited, and each generation is judged anew. These castes, the purity of these castes, are to be preserved at all costs in that, quote, there is nothing which they should so anxiously guard as the purity of race. Now that reverberates in the 20th century a little bit, but I'm not going to explore that connection. All right? Eugenics and Nazism. The highest caste of the guardians find their purpose and worth in the protection of the Constitution, which takes as its primary purpose, quote, not the disproportionate happiness of any one class, but the greatest happiness of the whole. At this point in his development, Plato is working up the basics of his state from its foundations. In starting at the level of appetite, with material production and consumption, Plato addressed his city in its least ideal aspect first. That is, he works towards the ideal from the lowest levels, the lowest realms of material exchange and human appetite and psychology. Now, with the education and role of his warrior class, he has moved upwards from appetite and the working class to the passions and emotions of the warring class. We're at the second stage, right? Appetite, emotion, what comes next is the big question. In contemplating his four primary virtues, courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, Socrates declares justice to be discovered in the hierarchical division of the state. Where do we find these values? How do we find them? In the ideal organization of the state. Justice is the differentiation of the city into its various specialized tasks, the organism of the city. Justice is each part doing what it does well. In terms of class functioning, and this has a direct class implication for Plato, this means the laboring class, the working class, obeying, the brave warriors defending, and the wise guardians ruling, creating the overall harmony and good of the whole. Airplane mode, please. Having found justice in the state, Socrates now returns the dialogue to the question of justice in the individual person, in the individual soul. To begin, Socrates moves to articulate the structures of the soul, those structures of the self which he claims make up a person, any person, all persons. The three classes found in the state here have an equivalence at the level of soul and are translated to appetites, passion, and intellect. In short, the animal, the emotional, and the intellectual. As the just state goes, so goes the individual. It will not cheat, nor lie, nor steal so long as each of part within itself carries out its function unimpeded and in harmony with its counterparts, right? So the intellect does what it does, the emotions do what they do, the appetites do what they do, and each part in the state, each of the classes do what they do, and if each of those do it right, there will be harmony and all will flourish, all will benefit, right? Optimal cooperation. It is only with, quote, the meddlesomeness and interference of the inferior in the rising up of a part of the soul against the whole, that the soul is rended into corruption and deformity, end quote, for Plato. Justice in the soul, as in the state, means that, quote, each part of him is doing its business, whether in ruling or being ruled. With this, Socrates declares that Thrasymachus' equation of domination with strength, with justice, in the individual has been defeated, as it serves no one to be miserable in either body or soul. The soul of the just must find harmony within itself, and if any part is dominant, the appetites, the emotions, the intellect, this imbalances the whole person. Happiness becomes impossible, and the only result is misery. So how can the just person pursuing domination, right, ever be the happy man or woman? In response to Adeimantus's and Glaucon's insistence, they now return to the state, right? They've dealt with the citizen, the individual, they found happiness there, but Adeimantus and Glaucon are now interested in pursuing this political agenda. Declaring the issue of class conflict in their city resolved, as each part embraces its role as well as that of others, Socrates restates his confidence in the overall harmonization of the classes and citizens, where, quote, all are of one opinion about what is near and dear to them. They all tend towards one common end. With this, Glaucon moves to ask how Socrates has actually made the case that their ideal state is also possible given history and human nature as they and we probably know them. How can this ideal come into the real world? How can we bring the ideal, this heavenly ideal, down to earth and make it work? Because we've never seen anything like it. And human nature doesn't seem to give us a reason or a precedent to suppose that this is really possible. So, put your money where your mouth is. With this, the quintessential Platonic moment of the dialogue has arrived. Here we begin to fathom, to make inquiry into the interaction of the timeless universal ideal of the good on the one hand, and its historical manifestations in the form of justice in the polis on the other, and their prospects for integration, the real and the ideal. That is, how do we make those two parts compatible, the real and the ideal? With so much of the life ordering of the polis family described, some of which I've left out in terms of the common holding of wives, the communism of property, and the organization of mating, which is very elaborate and intriguing, what has arrived is a consideration of the viability of the ideal state in real time and real history. Does its status as an ideal make it a historical impossibility? Does a conflict between his ideal and the real run through time, our time, so as to make his aspirations foolish, as many have and continue to this day to claim? Many still look at Plato as a dreamer. To what universal and timeless map can our reason, refer in order to plot, to find a compass towards the good political course through history that Plato aspires to? It is the metaphysical question of the conceptual foundations of justice for the polis, which Plato now has to address in order to found his historical city after a timeless, quote, heavenly pattern of the universal form of the good. It is this interplay of the real and the ideal, Socrates' third wave, as the greatest and heaviest, which Plato now tackles. Where can we look to find an example that has never existed? Do we do it through our eyes, through history, or through the mind? History, Socrates admits, is clearly in rebellion against the realization of his idealistic words and dreams. Nevertheless, he claims that since his argument aspires to the ideal state, there is no need to limit himself to precedent and experience. Just because such a state has never existed does not mean that it is not ideal. And if it is objectively ideal, it ought clearly to be possible. Conditional upon overcoming this great wave of political transformation, Plato, through Socrates, makes one of his most famous claims. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, cities will never have rest from their evils. Let me read that again. Until philosophers are kings, or the kings and princes of this world have the spirit and power of philosophy, cities will never have rest from their evils. With this bold statement, Plato makes clear the philosophical conditions for his political program through Socrates, his advocate in the Republic. It is the disclosure of the ideal through the philosopher's political authorship with which Plato seeks to establish true political authority and make it concrete in the real world. Plato here sounds his clear endorsement of the rule of a philosopher class over those, quote, commoner natures who are destined to be ruled. Driven on by Glaucon's concerns as to who the true philosophers are, given their bad reputation in the 4th century BC, and the slippery definition of philosophy in his day, Plato moves to distinguish his philosophers from imitators, from imitation, and poor imitation at that, from his point of view. From their contemplation of timeless ideas, philosophers emerge to a status of a very different quality and nature than their diverse fellow citizens. Above the fray, the interaction of very different quality and nature than their diverse fellow citizens, free of fear and vanity, Plato's, quote, spectators of all time and all existence. Spectators of all time and all existence. They see something permanent which isn't subject to transient or historical change. They preside over the polis as near divine arbiters or prophets for the political community, taking down from the heavens the perfect ideas and delivering them and deliberating them to the political community, to the polis. Coming out of his parable of the ship of state, we learn that the true philosopher for Plato is a lover of truth first and foremost. They are those who stand in strongest contrast with the politicians and the sophists, the commercial philosophers and orators of his day. Those are, again, the politicians and the sophists, ones who took money for doing politics or for teaching others to persuade and gain celebrity and status. The greatest corrupting force for politics, Plato informs us, is, quote, the mighty strong beast of public opinion, end quote, which is no more than the essential spirit of common politics and democratic parlance. It is this condition which has brought philosophy, from his point of view, to worldly shame. And it is this which Plato seeks to remedy by restoring philosophy and philosophers to the rightful place of political leadership. Having redeemed philosophy from its bad reputation, Socrates now returns to consider the philosophical training necessary to restore its good name for the rulers and those who would take on the mantle of philosophical guidance in the government. Against the real-world politicians and sophists who we just spoke about, who think only of reputation, persuasion, and status, Plato presents a philosopher who keeps his gaze upon the permanent realm of ideas and is interested only in truth. The rule of the universal here, the universal idea, which we'll explain in a minute, is made the model for the correct ordering of the polis. As such, the world can only accept the rule of these philosophical few if they can be made to understand its necessity and basis. Though the terms of the theory of the ideal forms, these universal ideas that I've spoken about several times here, the outlines of such a theory remain wholly beyond the bounds of the text so far. We really don't know what these ideal forms are. And actually, as I'm going to mention in conclusion, I'm not sure we ever get the real content, a real substantive answer to the question as to where or what or how these ideal forms really work or what they are. This stage reveals a dramatic ascendance from the allegorical language of appearances towards Plato's language of the science of dialectic. Such a progression in the text mirrors the liberation of the mind, which is witnessed in the upcoming allegory of the cave, right? A real cheap shot here would be Neo getting out of his little cubicle and seeing the world as it really is, but let's leave the Matrix out of this, right? The moment has thus arrived to describe the true nature of philosophical practice in terms of its innermost idea and content. Where the first education provided only the one for the warriors, only a general sketch of the education of the philosopher rulers, a second education is now begun beyond gymnastics and music, which Plato bases on a central metaphysical scheme of the Republic, the doctrine of the ideal forms. The ultimate unity of the system of ideas or forms, as will be examined, becomes the intellectual essence and ruling principle of the polis's central political architecture and educational system. These heavenly ideas will become the model, these metaphysical ideas, the model for a practical training of all citizens, and not just the guardians, the philosophical class. Yet, as Adeimantus brings out at this point, the problem remains as to how the ideal itself may be made to replace the corrupt Athenian reality and the poverty of democracy, for which Plato has become such a famous witness. That is, how can we get to the ideal when there is so much resistance to it in the real world of corruption, common sense, hedonism from their point of view, and relativistic political practice? And for them, that meant democracy. And certainly with the Lebanese youth movements and the You Stink and We Want Accountability, something of this sort of problem arises. How do we move forward when we're so stuck in a corrupt and problematic past, right? And this is the sort of dynamic Plato is working with, and civil war, such as you've had, is actually not far off in his imagination, because this was a 5, 10, and 15-year recurrence, either civil war, invasion, political and class conflict within. These are Plato's primary concerns, and this is what's driving him towards, at any cost, putting together a unity and making all the parts cohere as a whole, because he believes they'll be strongest internally as well as externally when it comes to, if they're able to catalyze, crystallize this polis family, this political family. To answer this, Plato turns to a theory of knowledge and ideas in order to establish the philosophical method that his guardians can use to rule, first through access to universal ideas, and then by translating them into political practice. He here delivers his theory of the divided line, which separates and renders a hierarchy of the intelligible and sensible worlds. And this should be on your handout. I assume that everybody have the first or higher, uppermost graphic on that sheet. Okay, don't get lost in that too much, because it's hard to do two cognitive tasks at once. I'll explain it. The theory of the line divides the sphere. I shouldn't have actually mentioned it's there. I would have kept your attention better. The theory of the line divides the sphere of the senses, right? You got it works up and down. It's a hierarchy. The sphere of the senses at the bottom and intelligible ideas at the higher into their functions. The visible, the sensory realm, is a realm of belief and ignorance. And the intelligible realm on the other side is the realm of mathematics and pure knowing and reason on the other, at the higher level. The higher level of reason, thinking works with pure ideas above mathematics and acquires a truth of the whole, and at its uppermost, which we'll find out later on with the cave, and that is the idea of the good. Reason brings together all the parts of experience into the one truth of being, and in the political realm, this one is the unity of the state, right? So the model of ideas is also a model, and how the whole brings together all of its parts, right? Organization and organism is also a model, not merely intellectually, metaphysically, but politically as well. And this is how Plato works. Political question, metaphysical answer, political solution. This knowledge of the highest idea is grounded on the ultimate principle earlier discussed, the good. From this absolute point of reference, and it is absolute because there's nothing beyond the good is everything we know. From this absolute point of reference, reason at its highest level, the activity of which Plato calls dialectic, may once again descend, once it's seen the absolute, to the lower levels of experience to bring order to the diversity of phenomena, both logical, empirical, and political, right? This hierarchy of understanding is built up on 4 levels to which Plato assigns 4 mental faculties, which descend in the following order, and this follows the line from the top to the bottom. Pure intelligence is the level of dialectic at the highest, right? Active intelligence The second level below it, still in the realm of the intelligible, to that of mathematics. Faith at the third level is the level of raw sense experience. And finally, at the lowest level, is the level of illusion, ignorance, or delusion. And this is the level of human representation and imagination, right? So Plato didn't have a very high opinion of the arts, right? If the line divides true knowledge from false opinion, from its highest point to its lowest, then these implications await application to the realm of politics. He here speaks of a progress of consciousness, right, through which philosophy may take a foothold in the real world and begin the process of bringing the heavenly ideal down to political realization. Thus, the allegory of the cave, the second graphic, which I again shouldn't have mentioned, is set off to describe the actual ideological and social conditions within which human consciousness is held captive, diverted from truth, and ultimately perverted and corrupted. The divided line provided Plato with a ladder to imagine the liberation of the captives of the cave to the light of truth. That is, from the lowest levels of the line to its very highest. So let me begin to speak about the cave a little bit. In Plato's cave, in society, and remember, Plato's cave is not some far-off idea, it is us. It is the Athens of his day. It is the world of society and custom and convention. Humans unknowingly carry out underground, subterranean lives in the dark, in darkness. Their arms and heads are bound and gazes are fixed upon a wall cast with the shadows of real objects. A group of presenters cast these shadows on the wall by manipulating the objects and puppets between a bright fire and the wall where the shadows fall. Not far off from Bacon's Idols of the Marketplace, which we do in CVSP 203. For the audience, the shadows cast on the wall are taken as the true reality, right? They're seeing shadows, but for them, this is the real world, the truth. Voices are then projected into the cinema in association with the shadow images and are taken by the viewers as coming from the shadows themselves. This social and sensory education, inculcation, right, amounts to the world of nurture and would perhaps be represented by education, law, art, media today, and other social and political institutions which form us and our worldview, right? This is how we become who we are, and we know reality through this development. Even when set free, yet there's a problem. Even when set free from this captivity within the cave, the captivity to custom, convention, and sensory perception, these prisoners hold fast to the lessons of their previous captivity, right? They can never, they resist leaving the cave. They want to remain in belief of these illusions. If they are guided towards the light of actual truth and reality, they suffer from distress. It's painful. As the eye trained to darkness does from the brightness of the sun. Should the philosopher offer them orientation and inform the captives that what they now see is the real world, should they be dragged out of the cave? They refuse and reassert their former shadow knowledge within the cave. Should these same captives be dragged out of the cave and into the direct light of the sun and made to look directly into it, into the light of truth, they would be blinded and maddened, right? For those who escape the limits of the cave, for the would-be philosophers, their new point of reference will take time to adjust to and finally embrace. They slowly come to see the light of day without discomfort, and that is the truth of the ideas, and the highest idea being the good. Once having come to the sunshine of the highest truth, the idea of the good, they naturally come to understand its primacy, right? Both for reality and for social organization, and use it as a compass for human judgment, both philosophical and political. Having come to the startling escape, the newly liberated philosopher, person, citizen, now sets their sight upon the continued captivity of the remaining cave dwellers, to return to the cave and convince their fellows of the freedom and truth of the upper world beyond the cave, right? It's better up here. Come, right? Kind of a utopian message. Messianic, perhaps. Plato here asserts that the conversion of human minds to philosophy from the prejudices of socialized opinion and appearances is made all the more difficult by the conventions of common sense and the demands of daily necessity and custom. When we're all trying just to make a living, right, and enmeshed in social life and survival, it's very difficult for us to imagine another better world. We're busy surviving. Such a return to the cave, Plato warns, would be by the philosopher would be laughed at as ridiculous and likely denounced as heretical, right, against the dogma of the state, by virtue of the philosopher's challenge to the traditional values of the city. Such a mission would be a suicide mission from Plato's opinion, and the philosopher would be treated as a revolutionary, right, and an enemy of the state. Here then, clearly, Plato had not forgotten the personal experience of his teacher, Socrates, right? What happened to Socrates? What was his fate?
He got executed. He was executed.
He was executed. And how was he famously executed?
Poison.
Right? Hemlock, right? The poison hemlock, right? Okay. And this is taken up, I believe, in not the Apology, but I'm trying to recover the dialogue where he's discussing this with his... Can anybody help me?
Chryso or Phaedo?
Phaedo? Good, thank you. Okay. All right. Where were we? Okay, so the lesson of Socrates is death and his execution, his and denouncement by the city and by the polis, and within a democratic context, is very much an instructive lesson for Plato. And this is something that I think, organizes the text itself, and I'll conclude with that point exactly. In Plato's city, the statesman requires this ultimate knowledge of the idea of the good in order to be capacitated of rational judgment. The prison or cave of social and sensory experience is no more than the world of appearances and public opinion, right? Facebook would be Plato's greatest enemy in the world, possible. In having read the imprint of eternal truth in the final idea of the good, the philosopher returns to the polis with the blueprint for its transformation. In the ideal polis, the philosopher must rule as king and as the one who has exclusively received the philosophical and highest education. In this way, Plato delivers his justification as to how one who has been reared to the guardian class and has attained the highest happiness of truth must be now persuaded to give up his life in order to return to the cave. Remember, the philosophers who have discovered truth and who meditate upon the highest ideas of the good, of beauty, of truth, they're good, they're happy, they don't need much more, but there is a calling for them to restore their former fellow citizens, or the former captives of the cave, to emancipate them. So there's an ethical calling, right? With this, the true guardians have been found in the persons of the philosopher and the science of the forms, and Plato has made his case for the practicality of his ideal city. Where Thrasymachus had argued that rulership is the art of exploiting the ruled, of dominating, Plato has turned this position around to its opposite, so that rulers themselves are categorically pledged to the rule of the forms as the ultimate ethical authority. They don't rule for themselves, they rule in relation to these ultimate ideas, which govern them in turn. In this sense, the philosopher for Plato is very much a political prophet, an agent, conducting the gaze of the community up to the light of the sun of ideas. Through the practice of philosophical practice, Plato termed dialectic. The loss of the heavenly city within a democratic or a tyrannical or any other form of non-philosophical city is a form of purgatory, a form of exile, of alienation for Plato, and one which cuts us off from our true spiritual potentials. We must admit, though, in a critical light, that Platonic justice, as we see it here completed, is not attained through the willing agency, consultation, or perhaps even awareness of the citizens. Rather, it is found at the level of the organization of the polis as a whole, so as to bring citizens into conformity with the ideal, which few citizens alone can truly understand. In this rule of the one of justice over the many of freedom, Plato sets his city against what he sees as the ugly and inevitable consequences of democratic pluralism. The realization of the ideal polis is brought about through the spiritual unification of the potentialities of its citizens, and not merely through an education which takes those potentialities as ends in themselves. This distinction draws a marked line between the most basic presumptions of modern Western liberal education, right, and Plato's radical concern with the preservation and construction of harmony, regardless of, at the expense, perhaps, of the individual and their full development. Despite this critical note, Plato's concern was first and foremost with the frequency of strife, as mentioned, conflict and civil war of his day, and there is clearly limited value in dispensing with his political thought in favor of our ethical standards and those of contemporary thinking, which is often the knee-jerk reaction when we read Plato. Totalitarian, authoritarian, etc., fascist, etc. Nonetheless, it is difficult not to see strong class prejudice in Plato's political thinking and his order, as it is often expressed in his strong distaste and distrust, something which he makes explicit, a distrust and dislike of manual labor, of the working classes, and of a middle or commercial activity and the middle classes. Let me conclude, right? To bring this all together, the structure and the design of the Republic may be seen as a reflection of the revolutionary implications of the allegory of the cave and the hierarchy of knowledge illustrated in the doctrine of the divided line. The movement of the dialogue from the conventional sphere, the traditional sphere of Greek life, of becoming and change, to that of the ideal unity and permanence of being, reveals a teaching and philosophical strategy at work behind the dialogue. Here, Plato slowly refocuses our eyes from the historical level of custom, convention, and tradition to the higher ideal level and horizon of philosophy. That is, from the earthly, from the sensory, to the intellectual and the heavenly. The overall build-up from convention to ideal is a reflection of the movement of the soul, from the appetites to the passions, with perfection finally attained in the mind in reason. Each of these, again, represented by specific class, which plays a functional role of each of those faculties within the city. The myth of the earth-born citizen, of the myth of the metals, secures his hierarchy with greatest concern for class integration, for harmony within the polis family. Here, caste, right, is given mythic legitimacies, where humans are, by nature, born to a specific class and fulfilled by being prescribed, having their duty and station prescribed to that particular class, right? You fulfill yourself as an individual by reference to the class that you were born into, right? A caste system. Thus far, Plato has remained within the bounds of conventional Greek ideals and has yet to provide a justified foundation for his hierarchy specifically in argument. The search for an ideal and of an ideal justice within it necessarily creates the need to justify his educational and class constructions thus far presented, right? With this, the center of the dialogue makes its appearance at the end, and the second state of the Republic is begun with Plato's plan to found the city on a metaphysical system of ideas, his forms, his theory of the forms, which gives meaning to all his educational, legal, and institutional arrangements thus far outlined. The dialogue has fully moved through the transition from the conventional to the ideal, and from the lowlands of Greek experience and tradition to Plato's longed-for highlands of the mind in the one, the highest idea of permanent being and the truth of the good. This arrival of the soul beyond the cave of history signals the introduction of Plato's core philosophical and political program. Plato's protagonist, Socrates, his revered teacher, now sails into the wind to meet the greatest of the waves. Again, of course, the need to find the metaphysical compass, the metaphysical idea upon which his city can be founded. He calls his third wave the greatest wave that he has to overcome. Now confronts his construction. And that question is, what is the ideal ground and form of legitimate authority that only the mind can know and which has never been historically seen? Where do we find it, right? It is not until this moment that the philosopher has played any substantial role in the construction of the city. Everyday human experience stimulates an inner awareness of the problem of the one and the many, plurality and unity, right? This is both philosophical and political. This is how philosophical consciousness for him is triggered, right? We realize that there's a contrast between a thing which is a unity that we give a name to and all the parts that make it up, right? Which is the real thing? Is it its parts or is it the whole? There's a contradiction there, and Plato says that the whole is what gives the reality both to the whole as well as the part. That is its organistic unity, right? It's organic, the organic whole. Only with this rudimentary experience and understanding of the conflict of the part and whole does the mind arrive at the conflict between the sensory and the intelligible worlds, so as to be capable of gaining the philosophical height and perspective needed to witness the absolute ideas which order the world, the ideal forms. This evolution Plato takes as a model for the foundation of an elite philosophical education to raise the mind of its citizens from the captivity to the many impressions of sense, and by extension, to ultimately emancipate the polis as a whole from the wants, interests, and opinions of its many members, who often partake in internal conflict, in contest, and which don't allow a whole to come about when we're all at odds with one another, right? When we have sibling rivalries, it's hard to imagine ourselves in a family, right? He wants family at any cost. Where Plato strives to bring the heavenly pattern of the ideal forms down to earth, philosophical and political legitimacy, right? The philosophical and the political are entwined, made as one, so as to bring an end to the soul's captivity in the purgatory of the shifting sands of public opinion and sensory perception where, quote, appearances tyrannize over truth, right? In the sensory realm, right, our many impressions of our sense perception tyrannize. They distract us from the truth that only the mind can see, right? And that's true in the political realm as well, where the many voices of democracy distract us from our ability to see the one unified need and interest of the whole, the city, the polis as a whole, the state, and to accomplish the state. Plato's grand narrative of state, then, is first and foremost a philosophical project where political problems are subjected to the logic of metaphysical resolution. The cave dwellers, and this is interesting, to which he addresses himself are his fellow Athenians and Greeks, and the Republic itself becomes the educational exercise of the philosopher who has returned to the cave to seek the spiritual emancipation of his countrymen by political means. Thus, Plato himself, the author of the Republic, is also the heroic philosopher king of the Republic, the one who returns to the cave, and in many ways, its vengeance, the vengeance of the Republic, is set on redeeming the honor and spirit of the executed Socrates, Plato's revered teacher, right? This, if this was a movie, it would be called Revenge of Socrates. Though Plato has begun the work of the nature, to conclude the conclusion, though Plato has begun the work on the nature of metaphysical truth, there is a problem. It has been done largely in formal, poetic, and metaphorical terms, not metaphysical, but metaphorical terms. And as such, he has as yet to confront in content the core debates which he's dealing with between the realist Eleatics, who believe in the real existence of ideas, and the relativist Heracliteans, who believe that there is nothing greater than the senses and that all is how you see it. There are no absolute truths. Truth is how you see it. In this regard, his latter dialogues after the Republic represent a further and necessary development and sophistication of his theory of universal forms. As a result, the Republic's central metaphysical argument stands in need of further refinement in response to this problem of legitimacy, both for the sake of his theory of justice, ideas, and ultimately the heavenly city, the polis. With that, I bid you adieu. Thank you very much.